So for this module, we are going to be talking about boundaries. And for this week, your key characteristic is enthusiasm. And your key takeaways are, we're diving into habits, how to create new habits for yourself and for the office. And what are some of the elephants that can happen in the room, and how we can plan for effective communication. And how you can create boundaries in your work life and in your team life, and more importantly, in your own life. And as doctors and dentists, we have so many things that happen, and we're so many things that we're in charge of. And we want to be there as a confidant for our spouses, for our significant others. We want to be there for our teams. However, we're constantly seeing so many different patients a day. We're being pulled in every single direction, and our boundaries can definitely get crossed every single day. So for instance, and your biggest takeaways this week is how to protect your boundaries, realizing why they're important, identifying 3 ways you can protect your boundaries in your work life and in your personal life, and then having an action plan to implement this. And what I want you to do is share this in Huddle, and how you can communicate effectively with boundaries that you have respectfully with your team. Because as an authentic leader, and as we're defining what new leadership looks like, encouraging this dialogue so that when the team is much stronger as a result, you can empower your team to take over so that you don't constantly have to be there. And I did this in my own practice, and when I figured this out, I was able to shorten my time in the office for three days a week and still have the monetary results and still have the different types of cases that I wanted, simply because of the way that I was communicating with the team. And once they know and they're in, and you are all on the same solid footing, and they are thinking like you. And by the way, this is so different from some of the other consultants that will talk to you about keeping things separate from your team members. And in fact, it's the complete opposite, because when we have separation, when we have, and we can look at this with in business and in our own lives, when we have separation, there isn't a safe place for both people to grow. There isn't a safe place for that vulnerability or that shared connection to happen. When there is no connection, how can you actually influence your patient and your patient's behavior and the decisions so that they can make better decisions and choices for their own lives? Okay? This begins with understanding these boundaries. And this begins by understanding the psychology behind the thought process. And being able to have effective communication really depends on your boundaries and your boundary creation. So what I mean by that is identifying, well, what are your boundaries? And why are you not consistent in implementing your boundaries? So for instance, you want to be there for your patients, and so you start at the office at 7 a.m. and you have an hour and a half before your first patient comes in, or even your first team member. But guess what? Somebody's there, Jenny's there at 8 a.m. and she's knocking on your door, and she's got a personal issue. But you have this time for yourself from 7 to 8:30 to get paperwork done, to plan for the day, to check emails. This is your own personal time. Are you going to share this with Jenny, that she's encroaching on your personal boundaries? Okay, so this is the thought process behind boundaries. Or maybe it's not checking your email after 9 p.m. and making sure that whatever team member needs to call you after hours is an absolute emergency. Or case in point, that emergency number that we have, I remember after taking that emergency number off and delegating it to certain team members, and now there was a whole protocol behind it, I reduced the amount of emergency calls tenfold. I probably even got maybe 1 or 2 emergency calls after. And before it was about maybe 4 or 6 or 10 emergency calls in a month. And it would be patients that either they were driving by and they saw the number and they saw a billboard up, or maybe they didn't fully understand the post-op instructions, whatever the case is. And of course, that could be even team training and all of that. And there are systems behind that, and that's a different discussion. But what we're talking about is really creating those boundaries and making sure that you have those boundaries for you, so that after 9 p.m., no matter what, you aren't checking email. No matter what, you're not checking your phone or responding to others, that you have that time. And so this is within your own office. So if one of the supply guys or any sort of people start coming into your office to, grab your time, and your team, your first line of defense, knows how to protect your time. And the same thing goes for each and every one of your team members as well. So when you're raising the bar for yourself, you also want to make sure that you're respecting the bar for each and every one of your team members. And what would be interesting is if you all collectively would come together and create and share what boundaries are really important. And you know what that would do for your team and for your practice? It would do 2 things. It would promote this sense of empathy and promote this sense that you really do care for the well-being of your team, that you're taking it one step further to understand, okay, where they are, and know that if you are encroaching on a certain boundary, so that things are not taken personally and you have better effective communication as a result. Now, how can you create boundaries in your work life and your team life? Okay, we just talked about that. But when you're ready for boundary creation, guess what it does? It minimizes all of the elephants in the room. And what I mean by elephants, it's some of the things that we don't really like to talk about. We know it's there, but when we have our monthly meetings or our weekly meetings, we don't want to ever discuss it. And a lot of times it could be around salaries, it could be around negotiating pay, it could be around bonuses, it could be around all of these things that your team are so afraid to talk about. Okay, and you also want to encourage a dialogue of proper compensation. That's just one avenue, and this is what we go through and talk about live in consulting. However, for you and for this, the primary focus of this video is really to share how you can have more effective communication so that you can minimize these elephants in the room. And perhaps a lot of the elements could be around your feedback that your team really wants to give you. Maybe you're running late. Maybe there's certain skill sets that you're not good at, and being able to be a vulnerable leader in order to get that feedback so that you can take your practice to the next level. So there are varying ways where we can start incorporating this level of really open dialogue and open discussion that we see in Silicon Valley, that I see in some of the big businesses, and why a lot of times as doctors our egos get in the way. Okay, and I know we don't want to talk about this, but we're going to talk about this in the next module. And so some of the examples that you can do with boundaries are knowing what you will tolerate, knowing what you won't tolerate, and the times and when. Whether it's a patient that hasn't paid their bill, whether it's a patient that has canceled maybe 3 or 4 times, maybe it's one of your team members that keeps coming into your office as soon as you take a break and wants to gather your time. Or perhaps it's somebody, a colleague, a loved one that calls you all day just to check in with you. These are examples of how your boundaries are encroached on, and how you can refine that so you can be more effective in your life and serve at your highest level as a result. And also, again, contribute to that bottom line.